Imagine walking past your enemy in the darkness. Not running, not fighting, walking. 9,000 men, moving in single file through an enemy camp filled with 50,000 soldiers who want them dead. One wrong step, one nervous cough, one soldier breaking formation, and they all die. There's a young lieutenant in that column, 24 years old, his heart hammering so hard he's sure everyone can hear it. He's walking 3 feet behind an enemy sentry who's staring right at him. The sentry's hand is on his sword. He's suspicious. Something doesn't feel right to him. The lieutenant knows if he hesitates, if he shows fear, if he breaks eye contact, it's over. Not just for him, for all 9,000 men in the line behind him. So he does the most terrifying thing imaginable. He smiles, nods at the sentry like they're old friends, keeps walking, doesn't break stride, acts like he belongs there, like he has every right to be marching through this enemy camp at midnight. The sentry watches him pass, suspicious, uncertain, his hand still on his sword. And then he lets him go, lets him walk right past into the darkness. That lieutenant survived. Years later, he'd wake up in cold sweats, reliving that moment. That eternal second where his life hung on his ability to pretend he wasn't terrified. He'd tell people, "I've fought in 20 battles. I've charged enemy lines. I've held positions under siege. But nothing was more frightening than walking calmly past a man who would kill me if he knew who I was." This is the story of the Midnight Escape, the most audacious military operation in warfare history. When 9,000 surrounded soldiers decided that the only way out was straight through the middle of their enemy's camp. When courage met absolute insanity, and somehow, impossibly, it worked. Picture this, an entire army, encircled, doomed. Every conventional military mind says they're finished. Surrender or die, those are the only options. But one commander looks at the situation and sees something no one else does. A third option, so insane, so impossible, so brilliant that it just might work. Walk through them. Don't fight them. Don't sneak around them. Walk straight through their camp like you belong there. 9,000 men pretending to be enemy reinforcements, marching through darkness, betting their lives on confidence and deception. By dawn, when the enemy realizes what happened, the surrounded army has vanished like ghosts. 9,000 men who should have been captured or killed are miles away, free, having pulled off an escape so bold that military historians still study it with disbelief. But here's what breaks your heart. Not all 9,000 made it. Some panicked. Some were recognized. Some made mistakes that cost them their lives. And every man who survived carried the memory of walking past enemies who could have killed them at any moment, of maintaining composure when everything inside them screamed to run, of trusting a plan that seemed like collective suicide. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about courage forever. This isn't about warriors charging into battle. This is about soldiers walking calmly into the lion's den, knowing that the slightest mistake means death, that their survival depends not on their sword arm, but on their ability to act, to perform, to convince the enemy that they're not enemies at all. If you skip this story, you're missing one of humanity's greatest lessons, that sometimes the boldest action is the quietest one, that courage isn't always loud, that 9,000 men gambling everything on a midnight walk through hell deserves to be remembered, because they did it. Against every odd, against all logic, they walked through the enemy camp and lived. Let me tell you how. Main body, the setup. The army of 9,000 had been marching for 3 weeks when they walked into the trap. They were a veteran force, experienced soldiers returning from a successful campaign in hostile territory. They'd won their battles, achieved their objectives, and were heading home through enemy lands, taking the most direct route because speed seemed more important than caution. Their commander was a capable officer with years of experience, but he'd made a critical error. He'd underestimated how quickly the enemy could mobilize in response to their movements. The enemy had been tracking them for days. Multiple regional forces, normally fractured and competitive, had temporarily unified with a single purpose: trap and destroy this invading army. They had the advantage of fighting on home ground, knowing the terrain intimately, and they'd used that knowledge to orchestrate a perfect encirclement. It happened at dusk on a day that had seemed unremarkable. The 9,000 soldiers were marching through a valley, making good time, expecting to reach friendly territory within a week. That's when scouts came racing back with terrifying news. Enemy forces ahead. Enemy forces behind. Enemy forces on both ridges overlooking the valley. They were surrounded. Completely. 50,000 enemy soldiers had positioned themselves in a massive circle, cutting off every escape route. The valley that had seemed like convenient terrain was actually a killing ground, and the army had marched right into it. The commander called an emergency council with his senior officers. They assessed the situation with growing dread. The numbers were impossibly bad. They were outnumbered more than 5-1. The terrain favored the enemy. The ridges provided perfect positions for archers and allowed enemy forces to attack downhill. Their supplies were limited, maybe 3 days of food, less if they rationed strictly. Fighting their way out was discussed and dismissed. Even if they could break through one section of the encirclement, unlikely given the numbers, they'd be pursued and harassed, taking devastating casualties. Thousands would die in any direct combat scenario. Holding their position and hoping for rescue was equally hopeless. No relief force was close enough to help. They could maybe hold for a few days, but then starvation would do what the enemy's swords couldn't. Surrender was the logical option. At least it would save lives, even if it meant imprisonment or ransom. Some officers advocated for this immediately, but the commander knew his enemy. These weren't professional soldiers who followed established rules of war. These were regional forces driven by revenge for the campaign his army had just completed. Surrender would likely lead to massacre or, at best, brutal captivity with no guarantee of survival. So he sat in his tent that night, staring at maps by candlelight, looking for an option that didn't exist. Every military principle he'd learned said the situation was hopeless. Every tactical analysis led to the same conclusion. His army was finished. That's when he stopped thinking like a soldier and started thinking like a gambler, like someone with nothing left to lose. He noticed something in the intelligence reports. The enemy wasn't a unified army. It was multiple forces that had temporarily joined together. They didn't know each other well. They weren't familiar with each other's units, uniforms, or command structures. They communicated through messengers and signal fires, not through organized command channels. And most importantly, they were expecting reinforcements. More regional forces were supposed to be arriving to join the encirclement, strengthening it to guarantee the trapped army couldn't escape. An insane idea began forming. An idea so audacious that his first instinct was to dismiss it as impossible. But as he studied the maps, considered the alternatives, and thought about the enemy's expectations, the impossible started seeming merely improbable. What if they didn't fight their way out? What if they walked out, disguised as the enemy reinforcements that were expected to arrive? He spent hours working through the logistics. It was insane. It required perfect timing, absolute discipline, and more luck than any military operation should rely on. But every other option was certain death or capture. This option, as crazy as it was, offered a chance. At dawn, he gathered his officers and presented the plan. The reaction was stunned silence, followed by immediate objections. It was suicide. It was impossible. 9,000 men couldn't just walk through an enemy camp and expect not to be noticed. But as they discussed it, as they worked through the details, some officers began to see the audacious logic. The enemy was disorganized, unfamiliar with each other's forces. They were expecting reinforcements at night. If the trapped army could gather enough intelligence, patrol patterns, passwords, the appearance of expected reinforcements, they might be able to create a convincing deception. One officer summed it up perfectly. It's insane. But so is staying here waiting. To die. At least this way, we're doing something. The commander made the decision. They would attempt the midnight escape. They had 1 day to prepare, to gather intelligence, to rehearse movements, to organize 9,000 men for the most dangerous march of their lives. The preparation was meticulous. Scouts infiltrated as close to enemy lines as possible, observing patrol patterns and changes of guard. Captured enemy soldiers were interrogated for passwords and protocols. The army gathered whatever materials they could to make themselves look like reinforcements, improvised banners, captured enemy equipment, anything that might help the disguise. The plan was refined through the day. They would move in the dead of night, late enough that sentries would be tired, but early enough to reach the edge of the encirclement before dawn. They'd approach from the direction where reinforcements were expected. They'd move in military formation, disciplined and organized, looking exactly like what the enemy expected to see. And most critically, they'd project confidence. Not sneak or hide, but walk through the enemy camp like they had every right to be there. Deception through boldness. As night fell, the commander addressed his army. 9,000 men gathered in the darkness, listening to a plan that seemed like collective suicide. "What we're about to attempt has never been done before," he said quietly. 9,000 men walking through an enemy camp. "If they discover us, we're all dead. If anyone panics, we're all dead. If we fail to maintain discipline, we're all dead." He paused, letting that sink in. "But if we stay here, we're dead anyway. At least this way, we die trying. And maybe, just maybe, we pull off the greatest escape in military history." He looked across the sea of faces in the darkness. Young men and old, veterans and newer recruits. All of them afraid. All of them knowing this might be their last night alive. "I need absolute discipline," the commander continued. "No talking, no running, no panic. We walk through that camp like we belong there. We are reinforcements arriving to join the siege. We believe that. We project that. And we don't stop walking until we're free." The soldiers understood. They formed up in marching columns, 9,000 men organizing silently in the darkness. They gathered their weapons, their supplies, their courage. They said silent prayers or made quiet promises to themselves. Some wrote final letters to families, just in case. Others simply steeled themselves for what was coming. At midnight, they began to move toward the enemy lines. Rising action, the walk through hell. The first challenge was approaching the enemy camp without being detected as hostile. The army moved in organized columns toward the section of the encirclement where reinforcements were expected. They maintained military discipline, precise spacing, organized formations, nothing that would suggest desperation or stealth. They looked exactly like what they were pretending to be, a military force arriving to reinforce a siege. As they approached the first enemy positions, the commander sent forward a small advance party, officers who carried improvised banners and projected absolute confidence. These men would make first contact with enemy sentries, establish the deception, and pave the way for the main force. The advance party reached the first enemy checkpoint. A sentry called out, "Who approaches?" The lead officer, his heart pounding but his voice steady, called back using the password they'd learned from captured soldiers, reinforcements from the eastern provinces. "We've come to join the siege." A moment of terrible silence. The sentry stepped forward, a torch in his hand, examining the approaching group. He was suspicious. Something felt off, though he couldn't quite identify what. The officer didn't flinch, didn't show fear. He acted mildly annoyed, like a tired soldier who'd just completed a long march and didn't appreciate being questioned. "We've been marching for 3 days," he said with appropriate irritation. "Our commanders received the summons. Where do you want us to position?" The sentry hesitated, then stepped aside. "Pass through. Command tents are to the west. They'll assign you positions." The advance party walked through. Behind them, the main column began entering the enemy camp. 9,000 soldiers walking into the heart of enemy territory. Every man fought to control his fear, to maintain composure, to keep marching as if this were routine. They passed enemy campfires where soldiers were sleeping or talking. They walked past supply wagons and horse lines. They moved through the very center of forces that would kill them instantly if the deception was discovered. The tension was unbearable. Every step could be their last. Every enemy soldier they passed could be the one who recognized them, who raised the alarm, who turned routine march into deadly chaos. There were close calls. An enemy officer stopped the column, demanding to know which regional force they represented. A quick-thinking sergeant gave a name he'd heard during interrogation, claiming they were from a province on the far frontier. The officer accepted this, grumbling that coordination was terrible and no one knew who was where anymore. Another sentry noticed that some soldiers were carrying weapons that didn't match expected equipment. He questioned this, growing suspicious. An officer explained smoothly that their force had recently fought battles and had taken enemy weapons as replacements when their own were damaged. This was actually true. It was a perfect cover for the mixed equipment the trapped army carried. The march continued, meter by meter, checkpoint by checkpoint. Each interaction was a gamble. Each encounter with enemy soldiers was a test of nerves. The young lieutenant I mentioned at the beginning had his terrifying encounter about halfway through the enemy camp. A sentry stopped him, staring with suspicion that seemed to last forever. The lieutenant knew his regional accent might give him away if he spoke too much. So he smiled, nodded, and kept walking, projecting the confidence of a soldier who belonged there, who had no reason to fear scrutiny. The sentry let him pass, though suspicion lingered in his eyes. Throughout the march, soldiers maintained iron discipline. When they heard their own language being whispered, they didn't respond. When they passed enemy soldiers discussing the trapped army, they showed no reaction. When fear threatened to break into panic, they controlled it through sheer force of will. The officers were crucial. They moved up and down the column, maintaining order, providing reassurance through their calm demeanor, preventing anyone from breaking discipline. They projected confidence even when they felt terror, knowing that their composure was essential to keeping 9,000 men from panicking. Hours passed. The march that should have been quick felt eternal. They navigated through multiple layers of enemy camps, past checkpoints and patrol routes, through areas where thousands of enemy soldiers slept mere feet away from them. Some didn't make it. A few soldiers, overwhelmed by fear, tried to break away and hide rather than continue the terrifying march. They were discovered and killed, their screams briefly audible to the marching column, but mistaken by the enemy for unrelated incidents in a vast, chaotic encampment. A small group was stopped by an enemy commander who asked detailed questions they couldn't answer convincingly. They fought their way free, creating a disturbance that almost compromised the entire operation. But the enemy, confused by supposedly friendly soldiers attacking them, assumed it was a drunken brawl or some internal dispute, not recognizing it as an escape attempt. The majority of the army kept walking, kept maintaining the deception, kept projecting that they belonged there, that they were reinforcements, that there was no reason to question their presence. As they reached the outer edges of the encirclement, as the densest parts of the enemy camp fell behind them, hope began to build. They were actually doing it. This insane plan was working. They were walking straight through 50,000 enemies and getting away with it. But they weren't safe yet. The final checkpoints were ahead, the outer sentries who controlled passage out of the encirclement. These were the most alert guards, the ones watching for any sign of the trapped army attempting escape. Climax, the final gamble. The outer checkpoint was the most dangerous moment of the entire operation. The sentries here were expecting reinforcements to arrive, yes, but they were also on high alert for any escape attempt by the trapped army. They scrutinized the approaching column with suspicious eyes. The commander himself approached the checkpoint, flanked by his senior officers. This was the moment where,